Good evening. I'd like to thank you all for coming out on such a dark and stormy night. I'm Patricia Princehouse, co-director of the College Scholars Program. This is part of our ongoing speaker series. We have one more talk yet this semester. On November 16th, Lynn Singer, Deputy Provost of this university, will speak on her research on children, drugs, and intelligence. Spring semester, we've got a lot of exciting things going on. There's going to be a Marvin Gaye Symposium. We also have Eric Foner coming in on March 6th in Strosacker. You can find information on this and more at the College Scholars website at case.edu. And to introduce Sam Fulwood here, we have one of our College Scholars students, Tim Butler. And I hope you enjoy the program. Thank you.
Sam Fulwood is a Metro columnist for The Plain Dealer and author of 2 books, Full of It, Strong Words and Fresh Thinking for Cleveland, and a memoir, Waking from the Dream, My Life in the Black Middle Class. Before joining The Plain Dealer in 2000, Fulwood was a Washington correspondent and national race relations beat reporter for the Los Angeles Times. Other major newspapers where he has served as a reporter and editor include the Atlanta Journal and Constitution, the Baltimore Sun, and the Charlotte Observer. Fulwood has been named has been a Nieman Fellow at Harvard University and an Institute of Politics Fellow at Harvard's John F. Kennedy School of Government. He contributed to the Los Angeles Times Pulitzer Prize-winning staff report on the 1992 Los Angeles riots, and his work has also been recognized by Unity Awards in Media, the National Association of Black Journalists, the Associated Press Society of Ohio, and the Black Media Association of Charlotte, North Carolina. So without further ado, Sam Fulwood.
Thanks, Tim and Patricia, for inviting me here tonight. I'm really happy to be here and be able to have an opportunity to talk to all of you all. It's late October and exactly 10 days from Election Day, and that makes tonight sort of a perfect time for me to talk about the upcoming state and national elections. I say it's perfect for a couple of reasons. First, I'm a newspaper opinion columnist, and there's nothing someone in my line of work enjoys more than giving his opinions. Normally I write them, and those of you who are interested in whatever it is that I might say can pick it up in the Plain Dealer and read what I think on Tuesdays and Thursdays. But tonight is Saturday. I didn't have a column in the paper, and every one of you came out on a nasty weather night to hear my opinions. So that's very flattering to me. And I thank the College Scholars Program for inviting me, and I thank each and every one of you for being out here tonight. I'm sure there are many other places that you could just as easily have been. Second, I say tonight is perfect for me to talk about the elections because I seriously doubt that anything I say tonight is going to have an effect on the outcome of the election. And this isn't false modesty at all on my part. It's quite the contrary. It's brutal honesty. To prove this point, I want to start our conversation with a totally scientific, unscientific poll. So I'm going to talk a lot tonight about public opinions and polling, but before we do that, I thought it would be a good idea to sort of conduct one right here in this room. So, but before we do even the polling, you got to have a little bit of political advertising so that you can do a poll. How many of you all have seen political advertisements on television or heard one on the radio? My friend the mayor doesn't have to raise his hand. Okay. You can raise your hands, yeah, if you've all seen one. So how many of you have formed your opinions based on what you've seen on a political ad or what you've heard in a political ad? Nobody. Not a single person? Okay. So now let me ask you the final question of our little straw poll here. I don't want to know who you're going to vote for. That's really not my business. Rather, with a show of hands, how many of you, based on all that you know about the candidates and all that you've seen in the ads and the like, how many of you know who you're going to vote for? Okay, is there anybody who is completely undecided at this point? I think I see a couple of students' hands. Well, that fits, okay. I think also that proves my point. You didn't come here tonight to hear me tell you whom to support for governor or any other race or public issue, and I have no intention, none whatsoever, of trying to persuade anyone as if I could. It's too late in the game, and that's not my purpose at all. No doubt, however, any of you who are here probably have read something that I've written during this political season, and you know where I stand on the governor's race. Last Thursday, I wrote in the Plain Dealer that I plan to vote against Ken Blackwell. I've written several columns critical of Mr. Blackwell, but in the most recent one, I noted that many readers have questioned why I haven't supported him. After all, as many readers accurately pointed out, we're both black men, as if that would be the length, breadth, depth, and width of my political reasoning, and it's not. So tonight, I want to talk for a few minutes about why I feel the way I do, and by extension, I want to offer an opinion, and it is, in the words of Erykah Badu, India Arie, this is just my opinion. There's no law to what I'm saying, as to why I and a great number of other black voters in Ohio and across the nation appear to be hostile to Republican candidates, even when those candidates are high-profile African Americans like Mr. Blackwell. I asked a friend of mine the other day, whom did she plan to vote for in the upcoming governor's race? This friend is a middle-class, college-educated black woman. I mentioned the demographics because, according to political experts, she's among the most likely of voters among African Americans, a middle-class, college-educated black woman. My friend told me whom she was going to vote for, but of course I'm not going to divulge her franchise to you tonight. She told me her mind was made up a long time ago and that there was very little likely to shake her convictions. So I asked her another question. I asked her what convinced her to decide one way or another about whom she was going to vote for. I expected her to say something about the issues or about some campaign strategy or perhaps even to mention the race of the candidates. But she said none of that. What she says was that she decided, and I quote, "I decided like I always do. I'm persuaded by some seemingly insignificant fact that attracts me to a candidate or repels me from a candidate." End of quote. I thought her answer was, to be honest, very honest and revealing. I believe that's how the vast majority of people actually do make up their minds. There's some facet or some snippet that they hear that they become convinced that that's what makes them like or dislike a particular candidate. Like snowflakes, every person is different. Even if we can't distinguish one from another when we see a blizzard, we ought to understand that the crystalline profile of every snowflake is unique. And so it is with people and their political choices. All white people don't vote the same or for the same reasons, even if it appears that in their aggregate behavior, their votes might suggest that. And the same applies to black voters. History tells us as much. And that's why I want to spend the bulk of my time tonight in discussion of race and American political history. I like to quote Joe Fagan, a sociologist at the University of Florida, who once told me that, quote, "It is impossible to discuss race relations to Americans without discussing history," end of quote. He said Americans don't know their own history, which makes it almost impossible for them to agree on something as emotionally charged as race relations. He also said, and I quote, that for every 10 minutes you talk about race, you need to spend 2 hours laying the groundwork by talking about American history. I think he's right. But I'm not going to talk for 2 hours about history. I know this is a college campus, and many of you would love nothing more than that. Maybe another time. But I do feel compelled to spend a few minutes talking about history because it informs my political views, and I'm convinced it also informs the voting behavior of large numbers of black voters. That history makes it difficult for candidates like Ken Blackwell to win the support of a majority of African American voters. Note, I did not say it was impossible, nor did I say that all African American voters would not vote for him. Remember for the duration of this talk, and maybe for the rest of your lives, that black voters are like snowflakes. Each one is unique. And for the life of me, I just don't understand why that concept is so difficult for politicians and political observers, and specifically those of us who work in the news media, to comprehend. I include the news media because conservative syndicated newspaper columnist George Will suggested back in February in a column that black Republicans stood to win in 3 key statewide races across the country next month. He cited Maryland's Lieutenant Governor Michael Steele, who is running for the U.S. Senate, former Pittsburgh Steelers star Lynn Swann, who is running for governor in Pennsylvania, along with our own Secretary of State, Ken Blackwell, and he said that they were all likely winners. He argued in the most ignorant and somewhat racially insensitive manner that these candidates stand to win because, and I quote him, they appeal to blacks by being black. George Will, something of an intellectual and student of history, ought to have known better than to have said something so stupid. Actually, I think it was more wishful thinking on his part than anything that's rooted in reality. Anyone who understands the GOP's use of the Southern strategy would have known better than to have said what Will said. So let's begin our history lesson with an examination of the Southern strategy, a term that was coined by then President Richard Nixon's political strategist, Kevin Phillips, who was, those of you who know political science and history, was something of Nixon's version of George Bush's Karl Rove. Incidentally, you should know that Phillips, whom I'm going to talk about a little bit more, basically has repudiated everything that he ever told Nixon now and has had a change of life about his political leanings. He's somewhat of a, if not completely liberal, a middle-of-the-road Democrat, which cheers me because it gives me some hope that Karl Rove can be saved. After the Civil War, Southern states gained influence over national politics because black people were fully counted instead of being tallied as only 3/5 of a person for election and taxation purposes. That meant that the Southern states gained seats in the U.S. House of Representatives and in the Electoral College. The resentment stemming from the war and the Republican Party's policy of Reconstruction kept Southern whites rooted to the Democratic Party. But the Republicans still competed very well in the South because they formed coalitions with the newly franchised blacks and with some whites. After the North withdrew federal troops under the Compromise of 1877, and federal legislation proved ineffective in protecting black voting rights, the party of Lincoln saw its base evaporate across the South. Unrestrained by federal troops, white Democrats enacted Jim Crow laws across the South. Black Southerners lost their voting rights, and the Republican Party lost its ability to effectively compete for voters all across the South. The region became solidly Democratic until the middle of the 20th century. During this period, Republicans occasionally supported anti-lynching bills, which were filibustered by Southern Democrats in the United States Senate. In 1948, a group of Democratic congressmen led by then South Carolina Governor Strom Thurmond split from the Democrats in reaction to an anti-segregation speech given by Minnesota Senator Hubert Humphrey. Thurman founded something that he called the States' Rights Democratic, or more affectionately called the Dixiecrat Party. He ran as its nominee for president in 1948. The Dixiecrats succeeded in only one thing, and that was denying the Democrats the presidency in 1948. The party soon dissolved, but the split, Dixiecrats and Democrats, lingered. Thurman went on to become a leader years later in the Republican Party. Between 1948 and 1984, the southern states, traditionally a stronghold for Democrats, became key swing states in presidential elections, providing the popular vote margin in the 1960, 1968, and 1976 presidential elections. During this era, several Republican candidates expressed support for states' rights, which was a well-concealed and easily deniable signal of hostility to the federal civil rights legislation that benefited the disenfranchised black citizens, mostly living in southern states. Now, I want to pause here just for a second to make a point. I'm 50 years old. I was born in Charlotte, North Carolina, which is a southern state. And the whole notion of states' rights resonates very well with me because I remember my folks talking about this. Almost anybody who grew up in the South in the 60s and the 70s, the notion of states' rights has a particular resonance. So many black people, whether they continue to live in the South or not, still have some resonance with the whole argument of states' rights because they have people who either immigrated from the South or still have ties to the South. The states' rights strategy was a huge success, and the South is now considered a Republican stronghold in national elections. Recently, the term has been used in a more general sense, that is, states' rights has been redefined into a more general sense, in which cultural themes are now used in elections, primarily but not exclusively in the American South. In the past, particularly in my childhood, phrases such as forced busing or law and order became equated with states' rights. Today, appeals largely focus on cultural issues such as gay marriage, abortion, and religion, and in deference to my friend Patricia, such things as intelligent design. Using these terms and its meanings and implications couldn't be any clearer to me. As I wrote in my column, I make absolutely no apologies for leaning left in my political views. Yes, that means I'm a liberal, and most definitely not a conservative in the mode of George Bush, Ronald Reagan, or Richard Nixon. For many people, being liberal is a dirty word. For those who throw it around like a curse word, it represents people like me who believe that government has a crucial role in the shared values and responsibilities of our society. In particular, I view the federal government as an equal partner in the nation's struggle against slavery and racism, providing the impetus for the civil rights movement and the growth of today's black middle class. What has been forgotten amid our ignorance of American history is that Republicans, not Democrats, were at the forefront of this, especially the civil rights movement in the late 1950s and early 1960s. That they are no longer is a paradox of contemporary GOP politics, and that animates most black voters' opposition to Republicans like Ken Blackwell, George Bush, Clarence Thomas, and most of all, Ronald Reagan. Let me explain this, again, by looking into the books of a American history text. Many Southern Democrats were attracted to the 1964 presidential campaign of Republican Senator Barry Goldwater of Arizona. Goldwater was more notably conservative than previous Republican nominees for president, such as Dwight D. Eisenhower. Goldwater's principal opponent in the primary election that year was Governor Nelson Rockefeller of New York, who was widely seen as representing the more moderate and pro-civil rights wing, the northern wing, of the Republican Party. Rockefeller's defeat in the primary is seen as one turning point toward a more conservative Republican Party today, and the beginning of a long decline for moderate and especially liberal Republicans within that party. Goldwater's primary victory is also seen as a shift of the center of Republican power to the West and to the South states in this country. In the 1964 presidential race, Barry Goldwater ran a very conservative campaign with an emphasis on, you guessed it, states' rights. As a conservative, Goldwater broadly opposed strong action by the federal government. Now, this is interesting because Goldwater, as a younger lawmaker, had been a founder of the NAACP in Arizona, and he had supported a great number early on of the civil rights legislations. But by the time it came for him to run for president, he had backed away from that. In his state of Arizona, he had also campaigned to desegregate public schools, and he made this decision about the Civil Rights Act of 1964 to vote against it, largely because he saw an opportunity to be able to get Southern votes, which he didn't think that he would have been able to get otherwise. It proved to be a disaster for him. Lyndon B. Johnson won in a landslide, and political scientists observed something very interesting in the election's aftermath. Besides winning Arizona, Goldwater picked off 5 Deep South states: Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama, Georgia, and South Carolina. Now, why did that happen? Informed people now agree that it was because the Democrats in those states voted in support of Goldwater's anti-civil rights and pro-states' rights position, which he had adopted just before running. At this time, Senator Goldwater's position was at odds with most of the prominent members of the Republican Party, which was dominated at that time by the East Coast Episcopalian establishment. A higher percentage of the Republican Party supported the Civil Rights Act of 1964 than did the percentage of people in Congress from the Democratic Party, as was the case with almost all of the previous civil rights legislation. The Southern Democrats were even opposed to their Northern Party mates and even their president, President Kennedy and President Johnson, on the civil rights issue. So by the election of 1968, Kevin Phillips saw the cracks in the formerly solid South. He used that observation to advise Richard Nixon on how to make those cracks even wider and to achieve the impossible, turning the Democratic South in favor of the Republicans. Social change and demographic change also helped. The United States was undergoing a very turbulent period in 1968. Dr. King was assassinated on April 4th. His death was followed by spasms of rioting in inner cities throughout the country. More radical black activists, such as members of the Black Panther Party and the Nation of Islam, scared white voters and were challenging Dr. King's policy of nonviolence. At the same time, young people, hippies, young white college students were protesting, often violently, against the Vietnam War. And there was something that was heretofore relatively unknown, a drug subculture, which was causing alarm in many sectors of the nation. And even women were getting in on the act because they were taking the pill and burning bras. Nixon took full advantage of all of these things that was going on in the society and ran a winning campaign on a winning issue, actually 2 winning issues: states' rights and law and order, which resonated with the deepest fears of people in the South who had been willing to vote for a yellow dog Democrat over any Republican. Nixon showed them how frightening that yellow dog could be to Southern whites, so that enough of them sent Nixon to the White House. Nixon was a clever politician. He seemed more moderate than George Wallace, who had run against him, the former Democratic governor of Alabama, who ran as an independent and was explicit in his attack on black civil rights. By comparison, Nixon seemed moderate, well, by comparison to Wallace, because he had mastered the use of code words. When he talked law and order or states' rights, it meant very little or nothing to most Americans. But to anyone who grew up in the South, especially black people like my parents and me, those are emotionally charged words. Because of this result, the election of 1968 is sometimes cited as the realigning election in American politics. As civil rights grew more accepted throughout the nation, basing a general election strategy on appeals to states' rights as a naked ploy against civil rights laws wouldn't have worked. It would have resulted in a national backlash. In addition, the idea of a states' rights superficially took on the patina of a broader meaning than simply a reference to civil rights laws. It began to eventually encompass federalism, as that was used as a means to forestall the federal government's intervention into the changing culture of our nation. Some people know that as the culture wars. Ronald Reagan must have, or should have, understood this when on August 4th, 1980, he kicked off his presidential campaign in Philadelphia, Mississippi, at the annual Nebosha County Fair. Reagan excited the crowd when he announced, and I quote, "I believe in states' rights. I believe we have distorted the balance of our government today by giving powers that were never intended to be given to the Constitution to that of the federal establishment," end of quote. He went on to promise that if elected, he would, quote, "restore the states and local governments the power that properly belongs to them," unquote. Code words, I think. Philadelphia, Mississippi was the scene of the June 22nd, 1964 murder of civil rights workers James Chaney, Andrew Goodman, and Michael Swerner. And his speech, Reagan's speech, sent a chilling message of the kind of policies that he and the Republican Party standard bearer would use to win the election and transform this nation. Now, just going to Philadelphia, Mississippi was not bad, because almost all presidential candidates at some point or another went through Philadelphia, Mississippi. But to talk about states' rights at that time, code words. Reagan's campaign was followed by the famous or infamous Willie Horton commercials used by former President George H.W. Bush in the 1988 election. And of course, in my home state of North Carolina, the 1990 re-election campaign of Jesse Helms, which attacked his opponent, Harvey Gantt's campaign, by allegedly claiming that he supported, quote, racial quotas, unquote, most notably through an ad which the Helms campaign ran, in which a white pair of hands are seen crumpling a letter indicating that he was denied a job because of his skin. Code language. Most professional academics, historians, political scientists, sociologists, culture critics, and the like, as well as Democratic Party supporters, agree that support for what conservative acolytes depict as a new federalism in the Republican Party platform is and always has been nothing but a code word for the politics of resentment of which racism provides the fuel. None other than Lee Atwater, who was Karl Rove's mentor, made this very clear. On his deathbed, Atwater repudiated much of what he had done to help elect Nixon and Ronald Reagan in previous campaigns. But he said these things to the late Ron Brown, who was instrumental in helping Bill Clinton in his campaign. They, for some reason or other, had formed this really remarkable bond with each other. But before he got sick, Atwater published in the Southern Politics in the 1990s a remarkable statement in which he said, and I want to share with you, his depiction of how he came to understand and to employ the Southern strategy in the election of presidential politics. Atwater said, and I quote, "You start out in 1954 by saying nigger, nigger, nigger. By 1968, you can't say nigger. That hurts you, backfires. So you say stuff like forced busing, states' right, and all that stuff. You're getting so abstract now, you're talking about cutting taxes, and all these things that you're talking about are totally economic things, and a byproduct of them is blacks get hurt worse than whites. And subconsciously, maybe that's a part of it. I'm not saying that, but I'm saying that if that is getting that abstract and that coded, that what we're doing away with is the racial problem one way or another. You follow me? Because obviously, sitting around saying we want to cut this is much more abstract than even the busing thing, and a hell of a lot more abstract than nigger, nigger. Since then, the modern GOP has emerged. In the early 21st century, the South is solid red, voting overwhelmingly Republican. Thank you very much, Lee Atwater. It has been used as recently as the 2000 election. During this election, George W. Bush's political strategist, Karl Rove, conducted a push poll suggesting to conservative Republican South Carolina primary voters that his primary opponent, who was gaining steam and looked like he was headed to win the nomination, John McCain, had fathered an illegitimate black child. Following the 2004 re-election of President George Bush and the low numbers of African Americans voting for him, I think it was something like 8%. Or actually, it increased. It was 8% in 2004. In 2008, it increased to 11%. But after the 2004 re-election, the low number of African Americans voting for Bush led Republicans to be just a little bit concerned about what they had been doing. So the chairman of the Republican National Committee and Bush's campaign manager, an affable fellow named Ken Merriman, began an extensive tour to develop speeches at meetings with African American business leaders, community and religious leaders, church meetings, and some college students in states like Maryland and New Jersey. Maryland was looking around for likely candidates that they could run, particularly African American candidates, that they could run and to attract black voters. In some of these appearances, Merriman did the remarkable thing. He apologized for the Southern strategy, which heretofore most Republicans never even acknowledged existed, declaring that the Republican Party would never be a complete or a majority party without receiving the support and confidence of the African American community. He went before the NAACP and apologized for that. The argument is that Merriman is said to be building a comprehensive effort to open the minds of African American voters to voting Republican and working to combat the stereotypes about the Republican Party that has developed in the civil rights era owing to the Southern strategy. Of course, many prominent Republicans don't like the fact that he has done this, and some conservative commentators have even denounced Merriman for his apology. Leading among those would be Rush Limbaugh and Sean Hannity. Well, this brings me back to my contemporary opposition to Ken Blackwell's campaign. Take a look at the people surrounding his candidacy. Take a look at the issues they espouse. Take a look at the promises they make for public policy. To my taste, not only are they in conflict with my view of the role of government in society, the language in which they are used which is used to espouse them strike my ears as being ripped right out of the states' rights playbook. Now, of course, there's nothing at all wrong with this. In fact, it's all good. Politicians should state their views and live or die at the polls based on them. I believe Ken Blackwell and other Republicans who share his views are sincere in them, and I am among the first to defend their right to hold and express them, but I don't have to vote for them, even if it's a black person putting them out. And I think I'm not alone in this position. Given our nation's history, and forgive me, I won't go into more exacting details on this part of the history, the federal government has served as a bulwark against the selfish urges of powerful institutions, oppressive majorities, and the worst impulses of capitalism. And I think this view of the role of the federal government, a liberal view, if you will, is shared for good and practical reasons by large numbers of black voters across the nation, and especially in Ohio. In conclusion, I would want to back that last statement up. Now, I know that there are people who disagree, and that's perfectly fine. One would argue that, and I've heard a lot of these arguments in my voicemails, that one would think that, well, Ken Blackwell isn't a states' rights candidate. He's not espousing the views. But the hurdle for Republicans to gain large numbers of black votes is that they have to be able to demonstrate in a very aggressive and open and candid and probably forceful way that they are a part of what Merriman was attempting to say, a new big tent Republican Party. And I don't think that that has been successful. If we look at the polls, we look at the likely, if the polls have any indication on it, the likely outcome of next, in 10 days, the election, we see that the three African-American candidates recruited by this big tent strategy, rather than gaining African-American support, as they have articulated their views and tried to put forward them in the debate or the campaign, they've actually lost ground. According to the Ohio poll conducted by the University of Cincinnati, on May 25th, Blackwell commanded roughly 32% of black voters likely to vote for him. By September 20th, that number had dropped to 20%. By October 17th, the same poll asking the same question showed that 16% of the African American voters stated Blackwell as a likely choice. I would argue that those numbers help reinforce the idea that without a strong articulation of the repudiation of the history of the Republican Party, even black Republican candidates have a very, very difficult time persuading the black electorate that they are a part of a new breed within the party. The contemporary situation with the Republicans, given all of the national situation, the war, the scandals in Washington, has made it even more difficult for any Republican to be able to articulate a vision that is winning a lot of support right now. The burden is even greater, I think, for someone like Ken Blackwell. And I don't think that he has been successful, even if the polls are one small measure of it, at being able to convince people. The polls also indicate that his likability among all voters has slipped throughout the course of the campaign. These are remarkable things that sort of suggest that it's not just African American voters who have their doubts. I think framing the outcome of an entire election in purely starkly racial terms is a mistake. The point of my conversation tonight was not that black folks are against Blackwell because he is black, but that issues go to the heart of what makes people decide how they choose to vote. Remember the straw vote of one person, the young woman that I asked, what was it that would make her vote? She had something in mind, and unless something else displaces that in a very strong and an aggressive way, her mind gets made up. I argue that most people are very much like her, very much like one snowflake, very different, but in the aggregate we can see the blanketing of votes that go into one party or another. I want to pause here, sort of turn the microphone around, and engage in a conversation with you all. Invite your question, comments, even criticisms, and let's have a dialogue about some of these points that we've talked about. I thank you very much for your attention. I think Patricia has a mic, and who? Okay.
I want to thank you for that very intelligent perspective on what's going on with national politics, the Republican Party and the Democratic Party. I'm the mayor of the city of East Cleveland. My name is Eric Brewer, for those of you who don't know me. And I am one of those people who you have characterized as being around Ken Blackwell. I am a supporter of him, though I am a Democrat in a city that is approximately 94% African American. The description that you have outlined in relation to issues, I think, is extremely important, because it is the framing of those issues that really is what this race is about for governor. For me, as a mayor of a city that's been struggling for the last 18 years in fiscal emergency, we were just released on the 6th of February. We have lived under Democratic Party rule for more than 30 or 40 years. We have a school district that's in fiscal emergency, 2,300 vacant houses and apartment units. Approximately 40% of our resident population are at or below poverty. I say that because, from my perspective of a mayor, the issue of home rule, the issue of right to work, the issue of local government control is very important. And I see cities like mine losing power and the ability to manage because the state government has taken over the right of local government to choose for itself in many circumstances. And I see in Ken Blackwell a restoration of those powers back to local communities. And let me give you an example of that, and you all have covered it in The Plain Dealer, which didn't endorse me either. Under the Democratic Party, under Dick Celeste, we brought collective bargaining to public employee unions. And I have watched, as a former journalist, I worked for the Cleveland Press and the Call and Post and have owned a few newspapers, communities struggle to meet the burden of employee payrolls, benefit plans, and I've even watched school districts struggle with attempting to manage their teaching staff based upon what makes sense in relation to management of the classroom to benefit children. But because the state, under the Democratic Party, decided to embrace the concept of public employee unions and collective bargaining, I struggle now with the fire department where I have to maintain 14 firefighters on a shift because of a collective bargaining agreement. I find it challenging to remove employees who ought to be removed because of poor performance. And as you guys wrote, and as lawsuits were filed against me, as I attempted to bring in part-time firefighters to reduce my overtime budget by $700,000 this year so that I could hire a couple of more police officers and service workers to work on my streets in East Cleveland, where sometimes we have 2 and 3 police officers on a shift, I find the courts and the system and the way the state government has been manifested historically now as a result of what Dick Celeste did to strengthen employee unions, they're working to our detriment. And so I see in Ken Blackwell, from the perspective of a mayor trying to manage a city, someone who wants to restore our ability to manage. The local government fund in East Cleveland represents $4.2 million out of our $15.4 million budget. And I was one of those mayors who bucked the Cuyahoga County Mayors and City Managers Association in supporting, they didn't support the Tell Amendment, I did, because it would have frozen the local government fund that the General Assembly has consistently dipped into to balance the state budget, and it would have added a 3.5% growth, annual growth per year, which would, for me, next year ended up bringing another $92,000 to the city of East Cleveland.
You're going to get to a question, or you're going to come
Well, I don't really have a question, Sam. I do have some perspectives here about what you said, because as a journalist, I mean, there are those of us who are in the game who are really on a day-to-day basis trying to struggle. And I think you indicated that you voted in 6 different states in your column. If another job opportunity comes to you, you'll leave Ohio and we'll be left here with an incompetent like Ted Strickland. And let me just tell you what I see this race is about. $40 billion, 58,725 employees, 400 boards and commissions, and 4,000 people who will serve on that board. I see in Ken Blackwell, forget his race, a former councilman, mayor, undersecretary of HUD, United Nations ambassador, secretary of state, treasurer of the state of Ohio, owner of Blue Chip Broadcasting, went from 1 to 20 radio stations, and a guy who is a minority owner of the Cincinnati Reds. And Ted Strickland, I see a 12-year congressman, a prison psychologist who lost his license, a preacher without a church, and the only budget he's ever managed has been the 18 people that work in his congressional office and $1 million a year. And Sam, let me just make this last point. From the perspective of government, it's all about business.
I think we've heard your speech. Thank you, Mr. Mayor.
Okay.
You know, Mr. Mayor is a friend of mine, and I respect you enormously. I happen to think you're mistaken, and that's, you know, it's a free country. We can be mistaken, we can disagree, and we can be civil about it. We will see how the outcome will come. With respect to the things that have happened in state government, I think it's somewhat of a stretch to blame them on Democrats, given that we've had how many years of Republican control over the state legislature? 16, is it? It boggles my mind that we need one more. In fact, we won't have one more if the polls are right. And that's going to mean that we're going to have, you know, 4 years of an incompetent. What have we had the last 4? I think that, you know, I think that there is a little bit of sanity that has to be brought into all of this. First off, one person in the governor's chair isn't going to radically change anything in the state. My fear is that when we look at, and I've written this in my column, when we look at the platforms of the 2 candidates, we look at the people and the issues that they are promoting, I don't see how in East Cleveland, Cleveland, anywhere, anti-gay is going to improve the economics of your community. I don't see how, you know, destroying the tax situation is going to improve the economic. People can disagree, but that's from my point of view. I don't see how those kinds of things happen. I don't see how the mean-spirited, rabid right-wing Christian fundamentalism is going to be of any benefit to Ohio's economy. I mean, for me, it just boggles my mind that people think that that's what this state needs.
Ms. Fulwood, thank you for giving me an opportunity to respond to your call. My name is Gerald Henley. My name is Gerald Henley, and I from time to time, I disagree with some of the things that you say, but I happen on this particular occasion, I happen to agree with you 100% in terms of Ken Blackwell's assessment and how he deals with the party issues, state rights, and that sort of thing. I don't want to be too detailed, but I do want to ask a question of you, and I have a statement to make, and I want to ask a question to see what your thinking is in regards to it. The statement I have to make is that there are a number of items that relate to party, and I understand what Mr. Brewer is saying in terms of the Democrats don't do this or don't do that for the African American community, but I being a former Cleveland School Board member and Cleveland School Board president, I have a real serious problem when all of the people that go along with taking people's civil rights away, when they remove the school board. I have a problem with people that, Democrats or Republicans, it becomes an issue of taking a person's right to vote away. Now, my question is one surrounded in the individuals. I can recall when Bob Hughes was the chairman of the Republican Party, and he had a different outlook of how African Americans, blacks, and the whole political spectrum was dealt with. I happen to think that it's about individuals in whatever party that they may be involved in. I think that it comes down to how they perceive individuals and how they perceive what goes on around them and what they think people ought to do. I happen to believe in watching the Ken Blackwell's campaign evolve, that what you indicated in terms of him making the effort to really attract black people into his campaign, he simply did not do. And I happen to think that no matter what Ted Strickland's, whatever his strategy or the people that he may be involved with, those people are people that have direct contact with the African American community and the total community as a whole. My statement is made, and my question to you is that here's a situation that we have where we have African Americans kind of going around in circles waiting on somebody to tell them politically now, I'm not saying the total community, politically, to tell them which way it is that they need to go. And I want to say too that I noticed that you mentioned Barack Obama. You mentioned him, and I wanted to know where you stand with him and his campaign, or how they characterized him, and why these African Americans that's in this particular community in Cuyahoga County seem to wait on some savior to take them into some direction. And I don't think that Ken Blackwell would be the one to do that. Okay.
The latter part of your question, I think, is really interesting. Not the former part of it, the sort of Messiah complex. You know, I've thought a lot about this. I don't believe that African American voters, particularly in the time that I've been here in Northeast Ohio, are particularly unique in this sort of messianic idolation of, in Africa they call it the big man theory. You get the big guy, and whatever he does becomes law and everybody follows it. For some reason or another, it strikes me that that is a part of the voting culture in Northeast Ohio, and that African Americans, as a part of that culture, embrace it as well. I mean, I think you and I probably would see it more acutely because we're African American. But as a journalist and as a political observer, I see it throughout the whole political spectrum in our region. It strikes me that, and I have a theory about it. I don't really want to get into the whole ins and outs of it, but I think it goes to the heart of how Northeast Ohio, Cleveland in particular, emerged as an urban power at the turn of the century. We had large numbers of immigrants that came into this region from across the water, who spoke many different languages, had many different cultures, and they came with an idea of wanting to be good Americans, good Ohioans, good Clevelanders, and they were willing to cast off anything that made them different. And over years, they came into a region at the height of the industrial age, where steel and autos and tool makers required strong backs and willing workers to produce goods. And it made Cleveland an industrial, what was it, the fifth largest city in the country at one point. We were slow, and I think our history sort of suggests, we were slow to move away from that whenever the industrial age moved away. And yet, those things that made those people who came here, made the city work, they still clung to the idea of a heavy-handed authority that says you punch the clock on time, you obey the law, you send your kids to the schools have ultimate authority over you, your political leaders, your ward bosses, your labor unions, whoever it was, exercised the thought. And the people followed in lockstep with that. And I think in large measure that's gotten us to be resistant to change, hostile to newcomers and outsiders who bring alien ideas into our community, and that we don't want to do that. And that it caused us to miss a transformation of our economy at the time when it would benefit us the most. We are probably now 20 years behind the point where we would stop relying on big steel and autos. Cleveland and Detroit are, I think, we're uniquely resistant, and we can see the trouble that both of our economies have gotten into. I didn't mention Barack Obama tonight. You're a careful reader of my column. I mentioned Barack Obama in Thursday's column to make a point, which was that I'm not opposed to Ken Blackwell because he's black, and I'm not opposed to him because he's Republican. I'm opposed to him because I don't like what he stands for. It is coincidental in my dislike of him that he is black and Republican. And I cited, for example, there is this enormous, irrational groundswell of talk, mostly among people in my business, the pundit class, swirling around Barack Obama. I don't understand it. You know, he may be a great president one day. He might. But nobody knows anything about this man today. We know absolutely nothing about him except that he looks good on the cover of Time magazine. And for me, that's not enough for me to say I'm ready to join his bandwagon and vote for him to be president. He is black, great. He could become the first black president, hip hip hooray. But until he says something or does something that convinces me that he wants my vote, I'm not cheerleading him. And I think that this is where we get in a lot of trouble. I have seen this before. For 10 years before I came to the Plain Dealer, I was a national political reporter. I am not wedded by temperament and profession to any party or candidate. And I'm going to confess something that I generally don't tell people in public. I covered, in '92, the Bill Clinton campaign. And in the early part of that campaign, I grew to despise the man and did not want to vote for him. And so much so that I withdrew my membership in the Democratic Party to be able to vote for Ross Perot. I'm somewhat embarrassed by that because then I started to cover Ross Perot. If there ever was a Fruit Loops candidate, that was it. And I distinctly remember being at the vice presidential debate in Atlanta in '92, where his running mate, a fine man by the name of Admiral James Stockdale, who had been a prisoner of war in Vietnam and probably was elected or was tapped to be Ross Perot's running mate because he was a fine man and had been a prisoner of war in Vietnam, was debating Al Gore. And he opened his remarks by saying, "Who am I, where am I, and what am I doing here?" And I felt so bad for Admiral Stockdale. Because at some point or another, Ross Perot must have vetted this guy, and they must have done some kind of research. For him to put a guy like that out there to be humiliated, literally, meant that I couldn't vote for him. And I was torn about what to do in that election. Now, I point this out to say that you look for the candidate, not the party, not the pretty face. Ross Perot looked at one time, the media loved him. They were following him all around, wanting to cover him. 4 years later, in '96, I was covering Bob Dole. And I would travel around the country mostly to old folks' homes because that was the base of his support. And people would come up to me, invariably they'd ask me, I'd be the only black person in the campaign entourage, and they would come up and ask me a singular question, and I saw it over and over. Do you think Bob Dole, if he gets the nomination, will pick Colin Powell to be his running mate? Do you think Colin Powell will be president? Boy, I like that Colin Powell. You think he's going to get to be president one day? And so there was all this media buzz around Colin Powell and his potential candidacy to be president one day that reminds me very much of the media buzz that was around Ross Perot and that is now swirling around Barack Obama. Nobody knew even whether Colin Powell was a Democrat or a Republican. Nobody knew. He wouldn't say. Nobody knew what his stance on any issue of the day was. They knew he was a general. They knew he had been involved in the first Desert Storm. They knew that he was the chief of staff. But nobody knew anything about his political stripes. And so at one point, Colin Powell floated a trial balloon, announced that he was a Republican and he was thinking about running for the Republican nomination, and people were cheering all over the place, blacks, whites, everybody who wanted this fresh face, which is the term that they're using now around Barack Obama. And Colin Powell came out and said that he was what 3 of his positions were. He was against guns, he was pro-abortion, and he was for affirmative action. And within 24 hours, the Republican media powers, led by George Will, took his skin off. I didn't bring that column. I could have read it. The column was blistering. And it was at that point Colin Powell decided, well, Colin Powell's a general, and generals aren't used to taking orders quite like that, and they don't like people to disagree with them. It was at that point all energy in his campaign went away. So I don't know what Barack Obama stands for. If he stands for something that I could agree with, I'll support him. I'll write columns supporting him. If he stands for something that I don't agree with, I'd be against him. So I don't know what he represents.
From what I have been following in the campaign, Ken Blackwell seems to be a little bit more from the distance from the mainstream of the Republican thinking than Strickland is from the Democrat. Having said that, have you seen any indication that he either has the power to change the political thinking of the party, or could he be successful without changing their mindset?
You know, I really wish that I would have supported Colin Powell because I thought he would have had the potential to change the Republican Party. I would support Ken Blackwell if I saw in the course of his campaign or anything in his career that that was a part of what he was attempting to do. That is, change it more toward the mainstream, more toward the middle, rather. In fact, he is more to the right of the Ohio Republican Party. And we can see that by evidence that a great number of the Republicans have not supported him. They're sitting on the sidelines with him. I do think the biggest impact that, that Blackwell could have if he were elected is that he would immediately go to the top of the list as a likely vice presidential or even presidential candidate on the Republican ticket. I really believe that. And I think that his winning would be sort of a signal of something, but I don't know if, well, obviously I don't even think that's going to happen since it's not going to happen.
Okay, let me try to get folks to shorten their questions. That was good. We're going to go here, we're going to go up here, we're going to go there, we're going to go here, here, and there, okay? So Jeremy, give.
I'd like to point out, and I'm a fan of yours, but that the media often seems to give Democrats passes, particularly in the governor's race. You know, Ken Blackwell is an African American. Agree with him or disagree with him. On the Democratic side, Ted Strickland had an opportunity to appoint a Harvard Law School graduate to be his lieutenant governor, Peter Lawson Jones, who certainly has paid his dues to the Democratic Party. Instead, he went with Lee Fisher. And the criticisms, I understand, I applaud you for, and the criticisms launched at Mr. Blackwell are generally based on his positions. However, the Democrats seem to be only offering criticisms, and that stems from the top nationally to locally. What reason would you offer to vote for Ted Strickland?
I think I have been pretty careful in saying or not saying who people should vote for. I think I've been careful about that. I'm not stumping for Ted Strickland. I'm saying that I don't want to see Ken Blackwell elected. That's not even saying how I'm going to vote. And I'm not interested in arguing on behalf of the Strickland campaign. That's not my purpose. I have never mentioned his name in any one of my columns. What I'm talking about is my concerns about the right-wing Republican ideology that's represented, I believe, by Ken Blackwell, and that's what I'm opposed to. So, you know, as I said in my speech, I'm not here to tell people who they should vote for. I'm not even telling you not to vote for Blackwell. I'm telling you what my opinion is about his campaign. Yes?
Good evening. In your speech, you mentioned that states' rights was a code word for something else. And I guess my question for you, and kind of piggybacking off what the mayor said, do you think that federalism also leads towards inefficiency and big government, which has gotten us, Cleveland in particular, in some tough challenges with the way our economy is changing?
That's an excellent question. Does federalism lead to big government, which has gotten us into the problems we were in? No. No more than a state's local government position has solved the problems that we're in. I believe that there is a proper balance of federal, state, and local governance. I believe that a part of the states' rights, anti-federalism notion, and this debate has gone back all the way to the founding of the country. If you go back and you read the Federalist Papers, you can see that there were people who believed in a strong federal government and then a more local strong government. And we're not going to resolve that with this state election. But I do believe, based on what I understand of history and the role that the issues that I am interested in and concerned most about, the federal government has been more of an ally than a hindrance. Now, yeah, there are inefficiencies, but there are inefficiencies without the federal government intrusions. I mean, Ohio has enormous inefficiencies that has nothing to do with federalism. The Noe stamp scandal has nothing to do with federalism, unless you want to consider some kind of electioneering for George Bush as federalism. But people don't want to talk about that. One of the things that I learned in 10 years in Washington is, quite frankly, there's not really a hill of a beans difference between Republicans and Democrats. They both believe in using tax dollars. They just believe in using it differently. Taxes have gone up under the current administration in Washington, as much as they don't believe in federalism. But they believe in spending it on armaments and global adventures and giving tax breaks to people who are affluent. Another party believes in doing something different with it. I don't agree with either one of them all the time. But when I look at, in the course of the history, particularly as it pertains to racial issues. Advances for African Americans to become full participating citizens in our country, from the end of slavery all the way through the civil rights movement, always came with heavy intervention from the federal government. That's what makes me a liberal.
Thank you very much. I have a question to you as a plain dealer journalist, but I'd like to introduce it by telling you my experience with Blackwell's office. I'll make it short as I can, which is that every, and I've worked very closely on election issues over the last few years, every instance in which almost every instance in which I've encountered his office, he has acted in a way that allows disenfranchisement of low-income and minority people. And that has not been covered very well in the plain dealer, and my question is why not? And I'll give you one or two quick examples of what I'm talking about. One is there's a federal law that says that every public assistance agency is supposed to register every client that walks in the door to vote. Now imagine what that would do if it were really enforced. We have appealed to Ken Blackwell. There may be a lawsuit. He refuses. He says, oh, it's not my job. Well, it is his job. It's in the law. That has not been hardly ever covered in the plain dealer. More recently, he's gone totally along with the new ID rules. He's in bed with everybody who is using non-existent fraud. And again, who does that disenfranchise most? Low income, minority, youth, and elderly. Why hasn't the plain dealer been all over this?
One of the really unfortunate and embarrassing circumstances of going out and talking to people like this is I'm often asked to defend or justify something that the plain dealer does. The plain dealer doesn't know that I'm here tonight, which is fine by me, which is also to say they're not endorsing what I say and they're not going to rebuke me for what I say. The honest answer to that is I have nothing to do with what the plain dealer does except write my column. I often write my column in my pajamas at home. So it's an awkward and unfortunate non-answer that I have to give you, is that what my editors and the editorialists at the plain dealer do is totally independent of what I write, which is basically my opinion. And so I don't want to defend the plain dealer, and I'm not going to criticize the plain dealer. They do their thing, they pay me to do my thing, and I think it's wonderful.
Could you write about this?
Well, I have.
Sam, Carolyn Watts Allen, I sent you an email. I don't know if you got it or not.
I get a lot. Thank you.
I know. First of all, let me say I appreciate your view of history. And clearly, the African American vote has been a football down through history from the moment that we began to get it, and during those times we were denied it, both parties. And so your issues of states' rights and all of that are absolutely correct. And history has shown that various parties have used those kinds of things in order to win their particular party's position. I've been a Democrat all my life, and I have no problem in saying that I have held to many of the Democratic views and the majority of Democratic views. But it is a stereotypical idea that seems to pervade in our cities and in our country, that African Americans as a group of voters line up with all of the liberal ideas that are promoted by the Democratic Party. The fact of the matter is, I'm sure you know, that many African Americans, if not the most, the majority, line up with many views of the Republican Party, such as anti-gay marriage and abortion. And if the polls are taken of our community, we would find that there is more of an even split.
Absolutely.
That there is some kind of idea that we line up with all of those liberal views. And for that reason, Ken Blackwell's candidacy is attractive to many African Americans who do share some of those very conservative views. Having said that, we also know that polls tell us that people usually end up voting their pocketbooks. And in this particular race, the state of Ohio is drowning, as is Cuyahoga County and the city of Cleveland. To date, we have heard nothing from the Strickland campaign that remotely compares with the agenda that Ken Blackwell has to help the state of Ohio to begin to recover its economic decline. And having said that, apart from history and labels and you know, stories of our horrendous experiences, have you personally looked at the economic agenda that Ken Blackwell is presenting as a person, not as a Republican or a Democrat or an African American male, but as a person? Have you looked at the economic agenda that he is promoting for the state of Ohio to try to bring us out of the hole that we have been driven into? Thank you.
Thank you for your comments. You're absolutely right. And I think that Republican strategists, looking at polls and looking at voter preferences, have come to the exact conclusion that you have. If a Republican, I don't think it has to be a black Republican, if a Republican runs on a socially conservative agenda, guns, school choice, anti-abortion, anti-gay, that person automatically gets the attention, if not the votes, of African American voters. That will happen. The problem breaks down when the candidate then has to talk about race. So that when they do that, in order for them to get elected through the gauntlet of the Republican Party, they can't be for affirmative action, which the polls would suggest that African Americans are overwhelmingly in favor of, by smaller numbers every year, but they are overwhelmingly in favor of. They are in favor of civil rights legislation. Those have been, since 1968, maybe since 54, the wedge issues, if you will, for African American voters. Not the economy, which overwhelmingly is the wedge issue for white voters. Increasingly, it's become these social issues, and particularly since 68, as I outlined in my talk, those social issues have become even more important for white voters. While they get black voters' attention, they are not the decisive thing. I said in my column, I would love to vote for a black Republican, or any Republican, if they didn't assault me with their stands on racial issues. And that has been the case in almost every election that I've had an opportunity to vote for since '76. And that for me is one of the wedge issues. Everybody else has their own wedge issues. Everybody has a right to their wedge issues. That's the one for me, and I would argue, based on the information that we know about black voter participation, that racial social issues are the wedge issues. Now, you mentioned voting your pocketbook. That's a really interesting one, because if we look at the 2000 and the 2004 presidential elections, we'll see that most Americans did not vote their pocketbook. Well, 50 plus 1%, because we had someone who was changing the tax structure that would not advantage the great bulk of American voters. Yet it was those social wedge issues that proved decisive, particularly in Ohio. African Americans voted 16% for George Bush in 2000, largely on the basis of, in 2004, largely on the basis of the proposition of anti-gay. And that's a remarkable social phenomenon that's transforming the way in which we look at racial politics. Now, if that continues, we may see more competitive races with black voters being in the balance, looking at these social issues. But 84% didn't, and I would argue that most of them were voting on civil rights-based type of issues, not economic or social conservative types of issues. Have I looked at Ken Blackwell's economic policies? Yes, indeed. I think that Ken Blackwell probably would have been a stronger Republican candidate had he not even backed away from his own economic policies, the so-called TAIL program, which animated, got people so excited about him when he was running for the nomination. That was one of the cornerstones of it. He secured the nomination, and the party regulars, the mainstream Republicans, compelled him to back away from it because that was going to go on the ballot in this election, and they were afraid that that would have killed him. But I think it would have given him more support with the base of the party. The social conservatives now within the state are kind of the only ones that have stayed with him for the most part. And I think that his TAIL program, which he backed away from, would have been horrendous for the state budget. And, you know, I believe that if he's elected, once in office, he may be able to attempt to do that again. I don't know. He backed away from it, but that was the cornerstone of his whole economic policy. So yes, I've looked at it and I find it wanting.
Yes, I'm a little bit puzzled by your comments about the fact that there's no difference between Republicans and Democrats, and the reason being that they all take the taxes and then they use them for different things. Well, I think, you know, if you call yourself a liberal and you're making sort of value judgments and evaluation on things, I think there's a big difference between taking tax dollars and using it on missile defense systems and expanding Medicaid. I mean,
you're absolutely, yeah, maybe I misspoke.
Yeah, and also I think that I can't understand why you don't use Strickland's name in your column. I mean, it's like something that like, is like Beelzebub or something? Or?
No, I'm not.
I mean, why would you, consciously say this is a name that can't be written?
Well, it's not that I can't. It's that I'm not stumping for Strickland. That's not the point of what I'm doing.
Well, it's not a matter of stumping. It's a matter it just seems like a contrived thing to do. But anyway, also a little correction on your historical analysis. Kevin Phillips was nowhere near a Karl Rove figure in the Nixon administration. He was a historical analyst who wrote a book about how the Republicans are going to take over policy. He was never a close advisor. He was never in the White House.
Well, you and I can disagree on that. I think there's one in the back. He's been trying to get, okay.
I was in New Orleans a couple months ago, and I saw the effects that hurricane had on the city, and then how the government response. They basically tried to use the hurricane as a way to shut down public housing and basically cleanse the city of the unwanted, elements of people that they felt that weren't human rights, that weren't human beings. And, and this agenda that the Republicans have on their agenda, I mean, it includes, the disenfranchisement of black people in the last election. It includes increased, police brutality like we've seen here in Cleveland. And I think we have to bring this to a stop. And if it's going to take more than just voting for some Democrat or something. I mean, we need to be in the streets opposing this. And so I want to know why. I guess I haven't read all of your columns, but have you called on people to do more than vote? Have you called on people to be in the streets to oppose all of this? That's my question.
No, I haven't.
Really need someone to pinch me because this whole thing is so surreal. I can't even believe I'm 32 years old. I've been a Republican for 14 years. I ran Jim Petro's campaign in Northeast Ohio, covering 13 counties for him. I've listened to you. I read your columns. I'm listening to everyone here. I have several questions for you and for the guy down in the front regarding disenfranchised voters. I don't understand that disenfranchised voters and how you think that Republicans are taking blacks or lower income people rights to vote. I don't think you have ever been in Ken Blackwell's office because it's in downtown Columbus. It's not at the Cuyahoga County Board of Elections. And are you asking the secretary to break the law regarding ID? The legislation passed that. And then the Republican Party did support Ken Blackwell. He beat my candidate in the primary double digit. So, and the social conservatives are the majority of the Republican Party, and those are the ones that came out and vote. So, I mean, I'm just listening, this is just bullshit, sorry.
Also, Colin Powell never ran for president, he never had a presidential campaign.
No, I didn't say he had a presidential campaign. I said when he was exploring it and he made that announcement about what he stood for, any hopes of his campaign was destroyed. You know, free speech is a great thing. We can all disagree about it. And after we're over, you and the guy down front ought to have a conversation.
Just to follow up on that, I don't think it is all a matter of an opinion. And, you know, he has an opinion, you have an opinion. I think there's some objective truth here. And actually, the reason I soundly denounce Blackwell is, one, he brought Bush into power, and I like some people that act like Blackwell's over here to the side and not really link him much to Bush and talk about finances in Ohio or East Cleveland is missing the point. They're ready to bring in fascism in this country. They've killed 650 Iraqis. Afghanistan, they got Korea in their sights. They got Iran ready to use nuclear bombs, and Blackwell brought them in. Blackwell and Bush are definitely, there's no big difference. The other thing is this, you talk about pocketbook. Wait a minute, let's talk about values. If you want to make abortion illegal, Blackwell says even if a woman's ready to die, she should not have a legal abortion. He wants it illegal. How many people will die in the alleys? Women that are not willing or ready to have the baby. And if you want to talk about where does life begin, well, we have some in the Revolution paper, articles on where does life begin. Because let's get that straight. That's not an opinion. That's science. The other thing is the repression, the Torture Act. Well, what do you think? Blackwell's against it? He hasn't said a darn thing about it. Against the Torture Act, which will come down on people in this audience. Let's face it, you think they're going to just stop at Guantanamo Bay? We'll either be in Guantanamo Bay or we'll be waterboarded ourselves if we oppose what Bush is happening. And so you could go down the line, Hurricane Katrina, but I think, let's take the gloves off. I think you're making very good points. I'd like a little more on why abortion, taking away abortion rights is a horror. Why gay rights, gay marriage being denied gay people and transgender people. These values that actually Blackwell even brought into McMichael's church should be denounced by all nationalities and religion. Blackwell is hooked up to the most right-wing, and you've made that point, religious figures that want a theocracy, where the most right-wing religious churches, whatever, are going to be running society. Muslims will be second-rate citizens. Mainstream Presbyterians and Methodists will be second-rate citizens. And that's what happens in a theocracy called Israel. Anybody that is not a Jewish person in Israel is definitely got problems, big problems. And so I'm just saying, I'd like you to actually address more about the link up with Bush. And you're going to tell me everybody in this room thinks Bush it should be supported, then don't support Blackwell. And of course, Barack Obama, Hillary Clinton, I'm a revolutionary, I don't vote, and I won't vote under torture. The point is, Barack Obama says we should bomb Iran, Hillary Clinton says we should bomb Iran. Tell me where concretely, where a Democrat's going to present an alternative. Thank you.
Thank you for your speech.
Looks like there are two questions here. Mainly, what does Blackwell have to do with President Bush?
Yeah, that's kind of beyond the scope of what I wanted to talk about, but I'll address it if you want. There's ample evidence, it seems to me, that the decisions made in Ohio in the last two presidential elections, hotly contested, suggest that the Secretary of State made decisions that showed partisanship toward one candidate. Blackwell served as the state campaign director, while at the same time making decisions on behalf of his candidate that affected the voting in the state. I am told that other Secretary of States have done the same thing. That doesn't strike me as adequate defense, but I do think that Blackwell, like Katherine Harris in Florida, were instrumental cogs in the election of George Bush. Well,
you may not like the Justice Department, but the fact of the matter is that's what the law says, that if we have problems with elections, then the Justice Department is the one that defends us as far as that's concerned. And in fact, it was the Justice Department that won back our voting rights in the South when you were a child. So the fact of the matter is they said that there were no illegalities conducted. Now, is there partisanship? I've never been in a state office of any kind where there was no partisanship whatsoever. This country is about partisanship. That does not mean there was a stolen or illegal activity that was going on.
I did not say that it was stolen or illegal activities. What I said was that there were decisions that made that showed favoritism. And I am correct. I will stand by. I will not argue with you about this. You can say all you choose. I appreciate your comments. I appreciate your comments very much. I think much of what you had to say is valuable and will be rendered moot in 10 days.
Okay, I think what I'd like to do here, because I'm thrilled to have this much participation, have people coming down here when it's hailing and sleeting outside to talk about this. I think this is fabulous. I think what we want to do is end the formal part, and then we will be around to talk. Please come down, continue this discussion, and let me, will you join me please in thanking Sam for coming down here.
Thank you all for coming out.